Ethics Part 3. The background for Socrates. Socrates was born in 470 BC and died in 399 BC, and he's still dead today. He was the son of a sculptor and a midwife. Like many philosophers, he was rather eccentric in his appearance and manner. It is said that his clothes were badly rumpled and that he walked about like a pelican. He is also said to be famously ugly, but very robust. During his life he served in the military like most male Athenians, and he also held various minor posts in the government. One thing that Socrates is probably best known for is the notion of wisdom. A friend of his went to the oracle at Delphi, and the oracle was essentially what we use Google for today. If you have a question, you want to know about something, you go and you look it up in Google, or perhaps in Wikipedia. And back then, since they didn't have Wikipedia or Google, they'd go to the oracles, who supposedly had a connection to the gods. And you would ask the oracle a question, like, should I engage in this business endeavor? Or should I go to war against this kingdom? And the oracle would give an answer back. And they stayed in business for quite a long time, indicating that they were successful, certainly, at many levels. But anyways, to get back to the main point, this friend of Socrates goes to the oracle of Delphi and asks them, "Who, oracle, who is the wisest of men?" And the oracle said back, "Socrates. Socrates is the wisest." And his friend returns to Socrates and says, "Hey Socrates, guess what? The gods have said that you are the wisest of men." Now Socrates, instead of thinking that he's something great and wonderful, he believes the gods must be wrong, because he doesn't see himself as having much in the way of wisdom. So he tries to set out to prove the gods mistaken, and the way to do this is, of course, to find someone wiser than him. He goes and inquires of the politicians, asking them about virtue and goodness, and all the things they should know, for they profess to have this great virtue and knowledge. But he finds that they are terribly lacking, and in fact, the politicians who enjoyed the greatest reputation turned out to be the most sorely lacking and the most ignorant. He then went to the poets, and inquired of them, for they knew many fine things, or so it appeared, and he found out that they too knew nothing. Then he went to the craftspeople, and found out that although they knew many fine things, they were in rather serious ignorance, because they believed they knew so much more than they did. And Socrates, considering the matter, would rather be himself, knowing that he knows nothing, rather than being like them, knowing some things, but believing they knew so much more. And so he took wisdom to be knowing that one knows nothing. Now, because of his interrogation, his questioning of the politicians, the poets, and craftspeople, through the use of the Socratic method, he annoyed a lot of people. He ended up being brought on trial for corrupting the youth, for believing in foreign divinities, and various other sundry charges, and of course was sentenced to death by hemlock. And of course he died in 399 BC. Now there's some question about the real Socrates and his views. Socrates himself, as far as we know, didn't write down his own philosophical views, apparently because he held that philosophy was a matter for conversation rather than for books, and so we do not know of any writings left behind by Socrates. Many of the experts about Plato and Socrates claim that many of the early Platonic dialogues, that is to say the ones written first by Plato, are reasonably accurate transcriptions of his conversations, and the later dialogues, ones written later in Plato's life, have Socrates serving as something of a mouthpiece for Plato's views. However, the truth, as far as what the real Socrates believed, is something that we do not know, and perhaps shall never know. Unless, of course, Socrates is right in his claim in the Apology that perhaps after death we go on to a better place and are able to converse with people. If so, perhaps someday we shall know. Now, when it comes to the actual ethical theory of Socrates, it seems to be this. He focused quite strongly on virtue, and the most important goal for Socrates is not merely surviving, not merely staying alive, but living well. But not well in the sense of having all kinds of fancy stuff, nice cars, lots of fame, power, etc. But to live virtuously, to live justly. And as he argued in the Apology, pretty much we're all going to die, but we can't change that. However, it is within our power to be good or to be evil. So although death shall claim us all, we can choose to live well or choose to live badly. Now, as he saw it, to understand what it is to live virtuously is to understand excellence, the excellence of a human being. And so, like many thinkers of this time, such as the later thinker Aristotle, he seemed to believe that the focus should be on virtue, that is to say, being excellent, civically moral excellence. And morality, interestingly enough, was a matter of success. Not a success in making money, not success in being powerful, but being successful in the moral sense, to truly be fully human. Now, the core question in this particular section is, why be moral? Now, the Greeks had an important assumption for the most part. There are obviously exceptions because no one in a culture believes everything the same way. But the Greeks generally held the view, consistently, that happiness was a worthwhile end, and this could be something accepted. Aristotle explicitly argued for this, but it was seen as the ultimate final end. Now, Socrates agreed with this. Happiness is a worthwhile end. But for him, it differed significantly from those of earlier thinkers. For Socrates, a person's true interest, leading to their true happiness, lies in being moral, not in being selfish or self-focused. And as might be imagined, this is still an important moral issue today. Is happiness best achieved by focusing solely on oneself, being selfish, or better achieved by being moral, by being a good person? And of course, the matter is complicated by the fact that some people, civically the ethical egoist, take being moral and being selfish to be essentially the same. Hence, Ayn Rand's famous The Virtue of Selfishness. Now, Socrates believed that people can be mistaken about their best interests. They can think they're doing what's best for them, but be wrong about this. And this seems to be, quite accurate, because people often do things they think is best for them, but it actually turns out to be not the best. I know this is true in my own case. After all, like everyone, I assume, there are things that I did that I thought would be best for me, but now that I, in fact, regret. And I'm sure that's true of pretty much everyone. Now, what about injustice? How does this relate to unhappiness? Well, Socrates takes it, injustice corrupts the soul and leads one to be unhappy. Now, one thing that's sort of unusual about Socrates' views of ethics is what's known as ethical intellectualism. Roughly put, and kind of crudely put, it is the idea that knowledge and virtue are one. This is based on his view called the unity of the virtues, which is the idea that without proper knowledge, without having, all the virtues, the other virtues can become ineffective or actually harmful. To be a little more particular about it, if a person doesn't have this unity of the virtues, have the proper virtues, but only some, they can be very dangerous and villainous indeed. For example, consider, if you will, the classic, villains of movies and history. They're clearly people who have considerable capabilities. I mean, take, for example, Darth Vader, the classic Star Wars. He is a person that is, intelligent, powerful, capable, yet rather evil. And of course, we can go to Star Trek. You have someone like Khan, the Wrath of Khan, Star Trek II, and of course the original episode, the Space Seed. Khan is intelligent. He is strong. He has many wonderful virtues. But of course, he's a rather bad guy. And so having only some of the virtues can be rather problematic. Now, the thing that is probably most disputed and controversial about Socrates' view of ethics is this. He claims that to know the good is to do the good. Now, knowing the good in this case doesn't mean just intellectually knowing it. It means truly and fully understanding it, not just, looking at a book and looking up goodness. And he claims, and here's the most controversial part, that no one chooses to do evil knowingly, only out of ignorance. So for him, it is not a matter of being bad because of, say, a particular weakness, or being bad because one chooses knowingly and fully to be evil, but for him, it's a lack of wisdom. Now, this knowledge is not, again, just factual knowledge. It's not that evil people don't know that, say, for example, stabbing people, hurts. It's not that they don't know that, hurting people, and killing them, harms them. For Socrates, it's that they lack wisdom. Now, as might be imagined, this view was criticized when Socrates was alive. The author Euripides claimed that people did wrong not because they were ignorant, but out of laziness essentially, or because they preferred pleasure. And so people often would do bad things on this view because they were lazy about it, and evil presumably is lazier than good, or preferring pleasure, so they'd be drawn to pleasures and led aside from the moral path. Aristotle, the student of Socrates, rather the student of Plato, who was a student of Socrates, claimed most bitingly that the view of Socrates plainly contradicted the observed facts, which is a polite way of saying, as philosophers often do, that he was not only wrong, but completely wrong. Now, Socrates, a very influential figure, despite the fact that, as I mentioned previously, he didn't seem to actually write down anything in terms of his philosophical views. Most importantly, he had a huge impact on Plato. Also, an impact on the ethical theory of other thinkers to come after him, but probably his most influential area was in regards to his personality. The idea being that people often get into philosophy, either becoming, philosophers or just becoming interested in it by being exposed to Socrates through Plato. And the idea from his famous quote, "An unexamined life is not worth living," is something that resonates with many people. Whether they pursue philosophy in any depth or to any extent, people often find that very appealing. So one of his strongest contributions philosophically was urging other people to think philosophically. Now, his main student, or the person he mentored, was of course Plato. Plato was incredibly influenced by Socrates, and especially influenced by the fact that Socrates was put to death by the city of Athens. And many thinkers believe, perhaps incorrectly, that one of the things that drove Plato was this, that is, wonder as to why a society could not tolerate the existence of someone like Socrates, and what sort of society would be required to allow the wise and the good not be put to death. And of course this led to, or so some claim, the writing of probably his best known work, the classic Republic of Plato. Now, Plato himself was born around 428 or 427 BC to an aristocratic family. He was trained to be a political leader. It's believed he traveled around a fair amount. And, of course, in addition to the famous Platonic dialogues, there is, of course, his founding of the Academy. Now, in case you ever wondered where the name Academy came from, it's kind of an interesting or perhaps boring story. When he created the Academy, he located it in a grove sacred to a Greek hero, Academus, and hence it was called the Academy. So he built it in a grove sacred to the memory of the hero Bill. I guess we'd be studying in Bill Academies and talking about Bill academics. Now, interestingly enough, or perhaps boringly enough, like many philosophers and great thinkers, when he tried to put his views into practice by educating people of power and influence, the results were less than, shall we say, satisfactory. In 368 BC, and also in 361 BC, he attempted to educate the ruler of Syracuse, the fellow named Dionysius the Younger. He failed, and apparently, at least according to the stories, he barely escaped with his life in 361 BC. And as a general rule, if your students are trying to kill you, that's generally a pretty serious failure on the part of an educator. Plato himself died in either 348 or 347 BC, and is of course still dead today. Now, Plato was known, and still is known of course, as being very concerned with developing a complete, comprehensive philosophy. He wrote on a wide variety of areas: metaphysics, epistemology, aesthetics, etc. Now, one of the reasons for this, interestingly enough, or boringly enough, is that he believed that you needed to develop a complete philosophy of metaphysics and epistemology, etc., before one could successfully address answers to the ethical and political problems. So the basic idea is, at least on some interpretations, you have to construct sort of a complete philosophy. You just can't do ethics in isolation. You just can't do political philosophy in isolation. You need to do philosophy as sort of a comprehensive whole, or at least that is one interpretation. And that brings us to the end of a little background for Socrates.